Good evening. Thank you for joining the Philosophical Muser Show. I did a video recently on 4 arguments for God's existence, 4 of the best arguments that I could come up with if we took the subject really seriously, as seriously as it deserves to be taken. And I thought to myself, well, what would be a good follow-up video? Well, what about the objections to God's existence, objections to the Christian faith that atheists have and agnostics? And I thought, wouldn't it be amazing if we compiled a list of those and went through them and had a look and see if we could set the record straight? So I'm delighted to have my wife, Zosha Knight, joining me as my glamorous assistant. Hello, Zosha.
Hello.
And thank you for being part of it. Zosha has very kindly put together, after a bit of research, what she's found as the top objections to Christianity via Google searches. And of course, I've engaged with this stuff before on various debating communities and forums over the years. So I have a bit of experience in thinking about these sort of things, but she's very kindly put them together for us and made a PowerPoint presentation. So yeah, I'm about to be interviewed live on Zoom by my good lady wife. Yeah, I think an interviewer should be intelligent, witty, but a little bit less witty and intelligent than the person she's interviewing, and Zosha is that. So so we're in good company. I'm kidding, of course. Zosha's amazing, and as you'll get to find out, she's an amazing person, very, very intellectual and thought-provoking. So yeah, we are very blessed tonight. So I think we've got a set of, I can see the first slide on a shared screen. So I'm hoping that's what you can see as well on video as the viewers. So Zosha, what have we got? What are the best objections to Christianity and God according to Google?
Well, thank you for inviting me to join in with what is a fascinating subject. And of course, if you talk to anyone who's not a Christian, they usually come up with one of a set of or a subset of some of these objections. So I'm really interested to hear the answers to or the opposite argument to the ones that would most commonly be brought up if you're talking to somebody about the truth of Christianity. So let's kick off. So the first one is, of course, that there's not sufficient evidence to prove God and that he remains hidden and silent and he could do more to reveal himself.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, this is one of the worst, but also one of the most popular. I should say from the off, I'm not trivializing any of these questions and objections that skeptics may well have. They're all interesting and worth answering. What I'm really trying to do is provide a response to the very arrogant way that Christianity is dismissed by some of these objections. So with evidence, you know, my question is, well, what do you mean by insufficient evidence? By whose standard? You know, by your own standard? And what makes you think your standard is a competent enough metric? You know, these are very serious questions that you have to ask when you talk about not insufficient evidence. You know, whenever I hear people say there's no evidence for God, I ask them to tell me what evidence would satisfy them. And they can never answer that question, or they can very rarely even attempt to answer it. You know, they might say something banal like, you know, he writes his name in the stars, or something they often say something that's verifiable in a sort of scientific sense, but in doing that, they're really just opening up a further set of questions that are beset by the same problems. You know, well, what do you mean by verifiable? In what context? Why would that be verifiable and satisfactory in your inquiry? How do we verify it? Does God want us to verify him in the same way that our skeptic wants it to be verified? You know, these type of inquiries and similar issues like them, you know, we really should keep an eye on those, I think, and observe the weakness in the initial position. There's an even bigger problem, I think, attached to the objection, you know, of insufficient evidence. It's no use rejecting Christianity with counterclaims that merely oppose labels that atheists have slapped onto Christianity rather than actual Christian or biblical claims. I mean, what does the Bible say about evidence for God? You know, if I tell a shopkeeper he's ripped me off because the bananas he put in my bag are bent, he can justifiably reply that he never once claimed that any of his bananas would be straight, you know. And I think similarly with Christianity, it's quite clear that God makes no claims of being easily verifiable or observable, except in the sense that he's already revealed himself in Christ. You know, in fact, quite the contrary in one sense. He speaks of being invisible, veiled and hidden, and the kingdom of heaven is compared to a mustard seed, which gives plenty of indication of God's intention in the creation story. You know, we have all the evidence we need in Christ and in the incarnation and resurrection and the New Testament. You know, there's no question that when people say there's no evidence for God, my experience is they're using it as a proxy for non-engagement in the very complex subject of God and evidence. You know, that's, if you're the sort of person who's been tempted to say there's no evidence, and many of you watching might have been that person, and maybe we've even had conversations before, you'll know exactly the inadequacy with which you've uttered it. You'll know you've not really thought deeply about taking evidence for God on his terms, or about what good evidence for God might look like, or why your attempt to think about evidence usually has almost no intellectual content. You know, I've heard this argument so many times, and you'll know the ease with which you've uttered the word evidence as a clumsy, half-baked attempt to avoid proper engagement with the full gravitas of the subject. So, not very convinced by the no evidence argument. To me, it so often shows people not really wanting to engage. If you want evidence, go to the Bible and find out how God says you can know him. And I think if people aren't going to start with that route and that method, then it shows me they're not taking the question seriously enough.
Yes, indeed. And maybe the greatest evidence is the relationship that we can have with him. Thank you. Interesting.
Absolutely.
So secondly, is the problem of who created God. So if God is the ultimate creator of all things, where did God come from? Well, where is the source of God? He can't be the first cause explanation, surely, because it leaves us the problem of where did God come from? Who created God?
Well, I think we can dismiss this one fairly simply and straightforwardly. No, I don't think that's good enough. Again, I think it's not really an attempt to engage with the subject. Cause and effect are properties of the physical universe. We are physical beings in physical time and space, what Einstein calls space-time. And as humans who've evolved in that four-dimensional space-time, we can't easily escape our notions of cause, effect, before, after, you know, X caused Y, X came before Y, that sort of thing. But of course, God is of a different genus. It's a very weak objection, in my view, to say that who created God is a good reason to think that God might not exist. Because if we don't think of God as being entirely of a different consideration to our notion of cause and effect, then we're not really engaging on the matter on our own terms. And I think people who really want to take the subject seriously would probably not ask that question for very long.
Interesting. So we come to one of the bigger old chestnuts, which most people would ask once you get into a discussion with them, and that's about suffering in the world. How is it possible that we live in a world with so much suffering if God is all powerful and all loving?
Yeah, it's probably the biggest question, isn't it? It's centuries old, millennia old. It's the question of theodicy. It's the question of the pain and hardship that we go through as created beings. Look, I'm not gonna trivialize it. I'm not gonna say that when we're going through suffering that life is easy. Of course, it's not. But if you're asking philosophically and to some extent theologically, then there's a big issue with the suffering objection. In my book, Letters to an Unbelieving Nation, it's what I call the commutative clause. And it's a vitally important clause, and it's going to probably pop up in some of the others too, I should imagine. If one is to discuss God, then what I'm now going to say is crucial in observing the strength of arguments from both Christians and atheists alike. So if you're unsure how highly you should regard this commutative clause, I would say, having listened to hours of debates involving so-called experts on a multitude of these subjects in the fields of religion and science, I think approximately 90% of the content was little more than a redundant tit-for-tat oscillations between the two debaters by virtue of the fact that they've overlooked this clause that I'm now going to tell you about. It bypasses the cardinal issues, and the clause doesn't just involve debates about religion, of course, it involves a multitude of subjects. So the commutative clause it's laterally quite complex, but I'll try and elucidate it with clarity. It's basically this: you should not reject a proposition with counterclaims that it doesn't ever claim for itself. In other words, don't try to reject something like Christianity by making counterclaims on its behalf that are not part of the properties of the thing that you're objecting to or the thing that you're assessing. So, and how that translates is, at no point does Christianity ever claim that there will be no suffering to endure. At no point does it say that God created a world where there won't be suffering involved. And there are lots of complex and very interesting and good reasons, I think, why God has included a world that has a potential for suffering and for pain and for growth and for development and all of those things and redemption. But so on those grounds, it fails the commutative clause, and it's not a valid objection. It's certainly one that it's worth discussing and being sympathetic and empathetic to people and having really good conversations about their pain and what they're going through, of course. But it's not in itself a valid objection to Christianity. And I think that should be established. I remember there's a psychologist called Bruce Alexander. I think his name is. I think he was from Canada, and he once looked at the subject of addiction. It's a bit of a flawed experiment. It's called the rat park experiment because you can overinterpret it, and I think it probably serves as well as an analogy, and then it equally well as an analogy as to literal scientific rigorous empiricism, but it's still partly true. So basically, he was talking about the nature of addiction, and he had 2 bottles of water in a cage with an individual rat, and one of the bottles had morphine in and one didn't. One was just water, and the basic premise is that the rat will almost always drink the bottle with the morphine in it and eventually die. But when he created what he called a rat park with the same one dispenser with sweetened morphine in and one with tap water, this park had rats with both sexes of rat in it. Had food, it had wheels to play with, that sort of thing, lots of good cheeses and that sort of thing. And the experiment showed tentatively, but it sort of indicated that the rats didn't, max out on morphine when they had a much more interesting and purposeful rat park to be involved in. And I think analogically that works well for suffering in our lives too. We suffer a lot less if our lives have meaning and purpose. And of course, as Christians, we know that meaning and purpose is given to us by a relationship with Christ. So yeah, difficult subject, not unsympathetic, of course, to the suffering, but ultimately not a good enough objection to say that that's a reason to reject Christianity.
Yes, and of course in the Bible it does say that God tells us we will have trouble, but not to fear, because he has overcome the world. In this world we will have trouble, but he has overcome the world. So
Yeah.
Yes, there will always be suffering, a lot of which is caused by ourselves, if we care to dig into the provenance of a lot of the suffering. A big question. So that's followed by a question about evil. If God is omnipotent and, of course, all good, then he could just eliminate all the evil in the world at his whim and pleasure. But evil exists. So therefore, does that mean that God either doesn't exist or that he's not all good if he tolerates the existence of evil?
Yeah, I've always found this one to be pretty weak because, firstly, what does the skeptic even mean by evil? This is the classic philosophical proposition, but it never really gets to the bottom of what is meant by evil. And I know people say, well, evil in humans and caused by humans, and some people say about the so-called evil of God by the fact that we have natural disasters and things like that. But what we're really asking is, in a fairly simple retort, I would say, God is all good and all powerful, yet he still created a world that has evil in it. That is the simple answer to that question. Again, it fails the commutative clause because there's no claim in the Bible that evil won't exist. It's a very fallen world, and we're in big conflict against human evil and the principalities that St. Paul mentions in Ephesians and Galatians. So the real question is, why did God create a world that has evil in it? And then when asking that, you have to then provide answers that demarcate both types of evil, And I think people should have a think about that. It's the Bible never claims there won't be evil, so claiming there shouldn't be evil in the world is not a point against Christianity. A better question for skeptics to ask themselves is, I think, what ingenious plan was God unfolding in creation by including evil in the midst? So yeah, not a valid objection, not a valid objection that will undermine the Christian truths for those reasons. I have got a couple of blogs on Christianity and evil if you want to take a look in the sidebar.
And of course, one wouldn't exist without the other, as in light and dark. There would be nothing to measure good against if there weren't evil. which is another interesting thought.
Yeah.
So moving on, what about the Bible then? The Bible, as we all know, has the Old Testament and the New Testament, and in the Old Testament, within the stories there are some quite shocking things, things that we in today's culture would find quite difficult to swallow, and things that tell us something about the nature of God that may be difficult to understand. So what do we make of these difficult things in the Old Testament?
Well, it's difficult to know what they really mean in terms of being an objection to Christianity's truth. I guess the first question is, well, shocking compared to what? Compared to something hypothetically superior, we think we might write in the modern age, maybe some of it, although I think the more you zoom out and look at the fuller context, the more you see the genius of God in the Old Testament. And there's an old Lutheran pastor once said to me, look for Jesus in the Old Testament in every passage, and I think that's pretty wise. I think it's as misjudged as criticizing the ingenuity of the gramophone invention because we learned how to play music digitally. I think it's a similar sort of objection. Even though digital music is superior, the gramophone was still a great advancement for its time. And I think similarly, in terms of the evolution of morality and seeing ourselves as creatures of a higher status than mere animals, creatures created in God's image, the Old Testament brings a significant advancement on what had gone before it. One of my favorite examples is in Deuteronomy, which an atheist once brought up to me and said, how disgusting it is that there's an instruction in Deuteronomy that a rapist is instructed to marry the woman he raped. That's an injunction in Deuteronomy, and the atheist was like, well, wow, this is barbaric teaching, isn't it? Well, yeah, maybe it's difficult to read in the context of a modern set of precepts and codified laws, but at the time it was written, that is a great advancement. Making somebody take responsibility for their actions in that way, and of course there's also the instruction to give the father of the victim some financial recompense. It's baby steps, but then all growth and development of thinking is baby steps in a sense at that period. So yeah, I don't think we can divorce the so-called shocking verses from the grand narrative that's being conveyed. And this is people being, for the first time in a codified way, being asked to be utterly accountable for their actions as individuals and as societal beings too. There wasn't the means of trial by jury and even the same sort of imprisonment mandates that we have now. These verses to me are part of the great advancement, the gradual advancement of humankind, and I don't think it's very helpful to look at them and think that God is some barbaric lawgiver in these verses. Yeah, that's my answer to that.
Okay, thank you. So moving on, we come to the question about religions, plural. So Christianity is one of many religions, and Christians believe that they know the truth and believe the truth, so they are atheists when it comes to all other gods. So are they right or are they wrong? Isn't it much more likely that they're wrong about their one God and that everything supernatural is wrong, is a fallacy? The fact that there are so many false and mutually contradictory religions surely means it's much more likely that they are all false, including Christianity.
No, I don't think so. I think you should, if you want to explore that to its full depth, I would advise you to go to an article in my blog. It's called How Economics. I think it's called How Economics Can Solve the Supernatural Problem. I asked and answered this question there because the first thing Jesus warns us there will be lots of false prophets and false religions, as of the Old Testament, and I think it's a very strange objection. Again, it fails the commutative clause, doesn't it? Because the Bible doesn't ever claim otherwise. It says that there will be lots of false religions. So to use stated Christian truths and actual fulfilled prophecies as an argument against the faith's veracity is another contravention of that clause. I think it's the opposite of the truth, actually, the objection. I think all those false religions exist because there is one true God and there is one true religion. As I say, I encourage you to read that article. I think it shows that if the truth is north, then most falsehood isn't blatant south. It's sort of north-northwest and north-northeast. You'd expect it to resemble the Christian religion and the Christian truths. And as I say, it's a very comprehensive argument. And I actually make it in the video as well, if you want to check the video out about God's existence. I think it's point 3 I make. It's one of the great arguments, is that we don't live in a world where supernaturalism has just been invented. So no, I think the other religions are just as likely, in fact, probably more so, to point to the truth of Christianity than the falsehood of it.
Yes, interesting. Okay, so going back to the Bible, as we know, is a book of books. It contains a lot of different types of writing, and some would say it contains contradictions and even errors. What about scientific errors in the Bible? How can we explain those?
Yeah, quite easily. The Bible is not a science book, so there cannot be any scientific errors in it. It's as simple as that. I know atheists love science to the detriment of faith, and I love science, but I have a Christian faith. The two are not in conflict. The Bible is the holy account of humankind's relationship with God and his love and grace towards its creation. It was written in a period in history in which none of the writers, especially in the Old Testament, saw the world through the same kind of scientific lenses that we are able to observe today. They wouldn't have had the concept of the vast numbers, the vast universal timescales. They wouldn't have had a global perspective. It's utter folly to take biblical claims and try to impute scientific inaccuracies to them. And where there are miraculous events, which people might say contravene the laws of physics, so they're anti-science in a sense. They simply show that science is too blunt a tool to capture the full range of God's genius. That's my simple answer. It's you can unpack it as much as you like, but that is the fundamental truth. So there are no scientific errors in the Bible because the Bible's not a scientific book. And if you perceive a scientific error, then you're not perceiving and interpreting your scripture or your science correctly.
Interesting. That brings us to the question of hell. And again, it's to do with why would a loving God create somewhere where one has eternal punishment? How could he set a standard that he knows that no human can meet, and then decree the punishment of eternal torment for not meeting it? Does that seem fair? Does that seem like a loving God?
We don't. This will be quite a quick one, I think, because as much as we like to debate it, and I've got a chapter on it in my book, which is actually called The Genius of Hell, in my book, The Genius of the Invisible God, the reality is we just simply don't understand enough about hell have any proper idea about what we're objecting to. You might be disappointed with that answer. The viewers might want me to go into greater intellectual depth than that, but actually the truth is we really don't know. We know that God is just. We know that he will judge humankind and each one of us through the same love and grace that Christ judged us when he went to the cross for us. Nobody will be able to look at God and say they've been hard done by or they've been treated unjustly. There are many competing theologies about what the nature of hell is. There's a big movement of Christian universalism which says that that everyone will ultimately be saved. There are people who say that those who don't make it will be annihilated. There are so many different. There are some that say, well, it's why have we got to say what God's final judgment will be in terms of that? But I think my chapter on hell will be interesting when if and when it gets published to provide a very intriguing analysis of hell, particularly from the nature of our perspective and how we've gone about creating it in a sense. But yeah, it's not a valid objection for me because we don't know enough about what we're objecting to use it as evidence or a good argument against Christianity.
Okay, so yeah, the next question is one again that a lot of people bring up. If you're a good person, a moral person, why do we need Christianity? So many people say to me, well, I do my best, I try my hardest, I live a good life, I'm moral, I don't steal or cheat, or I try to live the most sympathetic, generous life I can. So I don't need anything else, do I? I don't need Christianity or any faith at all. I just need to be a good person. And you'll find that some Christians are less what we define as moral than many atheists are. So do we need Christianity at all? Can't we just be a good person and moral without a faith structure or belief?
You're absolutely right. Both are true. You don't have to be Christian to be moral, of course, and so many Christians are seemingly quite a lot less moral than many atheists we might know. That's definitely true. Both of those statements are true, but again, they're not proper objections to Christianity because you don't have to be a Christian to be moral. But that's because Christianity, and of course the Judaism as its precursor to some extent, presupposes an up and running moral awareness in order for its injunctions to be comprehensible. I have actually met Christians who say there would be no such thing as morality without God and without religion, but it's so blatantly false that it hardly even warrants a proper criticism because it's what's called in moral philosophy the problem of the criterion, which is about a statement about knowledge. How do you know that something is knowledge or truth without an up and running criterion by which something can be assessed under a metric of truth or falsehood? And the same with morality. When we read about the injunctions in the Old Testament, even the first injunctions in Genesis 1 about how we should obey God and do what God says, you couldn't make those decisions without an up and running moral conscience and a moral sentience that we've developed over time. So it's not an argument against Christianity. Moral awareness is actually an important prerequisite. And of course, remember that the Christian faith is about so much more than mere morality. If you just want to be in the business of trying to be good, then you're going to find out that you'll need more than that, and secondly, that goodness is actually finds its origins in God's goodness and God's grace. So it's true that so many Christians are less moral than many atheists, and that is unfortunate. But everyone's on a journey, and God saves people all different stages of their life. And, you know, whenever you see a Christian who seems less moral than they ought to be, I always like to say, you know, consider to yourself how much worse they might be if they weren't a Christian, and how much better they might hope to be in 5, 10, 20 years time with God working inside them, of course. But yeah, Christianity is a love story about God's grace. We're saved from our sin, but it's God's grace that puts it all into perspective, and it's about much more than being moral. We're moral because it's good to be moral, and we're ethical because it's good to be ethical, but it's about so much more than that too.
And of course, all those characteristics are a reflection of God himself, as it says, we are made in his image. So every time we display those characteristics of morality, whether we believe the Christian God or not, we are still reflecting his image and his character. Interesting. Yeah. So we're nearly at the end of our questions and our objections, but there's one more, and it's about creation and the universe. So the universe doesn't seem like it was especially created, does it? Isn't it just that we live on Earth, which is a ball of dust among billions of stars and billions of galaxies, and we happened to be the one that came along? Isn't it mere chance that we exist at all? That doesn't seem to have a very profound plan behind it. How is it that we happened to be at all?
Yeah, again, I think this is the skeptics not thinking it through properly. I take the issue of whether the universe is fine-tuned. If you think about it, there's no knowledge that will help us distinguish between a universe that is fine-tuned and one that isn't, at least not in the way that the atheists mean. You know, fine-tuning in this context implies knowledge of something alternative of which we can, you know, have no clue. You know, I think I use an illustration in one of my books. If a dressmaker states that a particular dress has been sewn wrong, then his or her argument is rational because they have a clear idea about what the correct stitch pattern should look like. But if we make the same claim regarding our universe, if we say that the universe is fine-tuned and it sort of has the right stitch pattern, if you like, then we must know what a right stitch pattern is in relation to a wrong one. And of course, we can make no reasonable suggestion, as nature could have brought about the same stitch pattern all by itself. You know, it's we've got no information about God that allows us to conclude that a certain stitch pattern is inevitable, given that God created it. This is actually a great rule of thumb for considering whether we can profess knowledge that something exists at all. You know, did X cause Y to happen? It involves the corollary question: is there any Y in nature that can be explained by X that can't be explained by not X? And that would be the sort of formal philosophical statement. You know, does Y exist? Involves the corollary question: is there any instance of Y that can't be explained by not Y, and vice versa? You know, and it fails on those philosophical grounds. And then the whole, you know, what is it you said? The Earth's a ball of dust among billions of stars in billions of galaxies. Well, yeah, you'll notice how that kind of proposition is used either by the atheists, I think rather dishonestly and disingenuously, as that happens to, against Christianity. They say that if we are the only life in the whole universe, then that must prove that our being here is merely the result of the sheerest fluke. I think I've got a blog about this as well, actually. I think it's called "Are We Alone in the Universe?" If, however, there are other planets which contain life of some kind, that must prove that we're not the special creation that the Bible claims we are. You know, they can both contentions are, of course, equally spurious, but it's easy to see how atheists sometimes like to have it all their own way, depending on which side of the erroneous objections camp they fall. And lastly, I think I would say, go watch my video on evidence for God, and there's stuff there about the universe. So, supposedly doesn't look like it was specially created. Well, actually, I think it does. It's quite clear when you look at the mathematical engine, that I call it, that drives what I call a bias random walk we see in our physics, that the active information has been intelligently selected to ensure that the high order has a high probability, given what I call the combinatorial search space within the size of the cosmos. That a combinatorial search space is the amount of different possible microstates within a macro state. And if you start to delve into that and look at that deeply from a mathematical perspective, you will not think that the cosmos looks undesigned, because of this. To me, it's also quite clear that the narrow scientism that tries to explain away the cosmos is inadequate, and that most of the things we hear on this subject from most people, they're just plain wrong. I mean, it's expressions of a more sophisticated, dramatic point of view are often counterintuitive, I think, for those ensnared in the quite naive scientism, because the physics produced by the mathematical patterns are thought by most scientists to be the thing we can't replace. Well, to me, it's like, I think I use this quote in my book. I think I said that it's like believing the moonlit night is the real illumination, because they don't know about the existence of the sun. So, yeah, watch that video if you're interested. I think there's no flicker of consideration that the universe looks undesigned to me. It's a work of a mathematical genius, which is what my book, The Genius of the Invisible God, is about, and hopefully will get published one day. So is that, you say that's the end? That's it, is it? 10, was that 10
That's it.
objections?
That is it. That is, we've covered a lot in 10 major objections. Of course, there are others, and we could spend longer unpacking each one of those, but thank you, really interesting and lots of food for thought.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for finding them and bringing them to our attention, and thank you for being a guest on the show. Yeah, I hope it was helpful to the viewers. And yeah, tune in for more videos later, and you can access my blog in the link below. Thank you for joining.